I never thought I'd be sitting in a courtroom. Not me, not like this. I've stood outside Buckingham Palace in rain so heavy it felt like the sky was trying to push you into the ground. I've held my post through heat waves that made the tourists pass out on the pavement. I've done 23 years in the household cavalry, and I've stood motionless while people screamed in my face, waved things at me, put their hands on my horse without permission. But nothing prepared me for the morning they put me in front of a judge. And not just any courtroom, the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, the one with the Gothic spires that tourists photograph because it looks like something out of a fantasy novel, the one that from the outside almost looks beautiful, almost. From the inside it smells like old wood and something else I couldn't name. Anxiety, maybe. My name is Sergeant Thomas Calloway, Household Cavalry, Blues, and Royals. And this is the story of the day a judge looked me in the eye, questioned my rifle, and got an answer he wasn't expecting. Let me take you back to the beginning, because nothing about that courtroom makes sense without understanding what happened 6 weeks earlier. It was a Thursday morning in mid-October, one of those mornings where London can't decide what season it wants to be. The sky was doing that thing where it goes 3 different colors at once, pale gray over Westminster, a sort of dirty amber above the embankment, and just a thin strip of actual blue somewhere behind the Houses of Parliament. Not enough blue to promise anything, just enough to tease you. I was on mounted duty at Horse Guards Parade, stationed at the Central Arch, the one that faces out onto Whitehall. It's one of the most photographed spots in London, which means it's also one of the most chaotic. Tourists from everywhere, school groups, coaches pulling up and disgorging 40 people at a time, all of them with cameras up before their feet even touch the pavement. My horse that morning was a black mare named Constance. She'd been in service for 9 years, and she had a particular way of expressing her feelings about people who stood too close. Not dangerous. She'd never hurt anyone, but she'd shift her weight, turn her head just slightly, and give you a look. I always thought of it as her professional version of what I wasn't allowed to do. We were 2 hours into the shift when the first thing happened. Nothing dramatic, not yet, just a man. He came through the arch on foot from the St. James's Park side, 50s, maybe early 60s, well-dressed in a way that was trying too hard, good coat, wrong shoes. He was carrying a leather briefcase, and he walked with the particular confidence of someone who was used to being let through things. He stopped about 4 meters from me, just stopped and looked up. Not at Constance, not at the arch, at the rifle across my lap. I get that a lot. People notice the weapon. It surprises them sometimes. They expect the ceremonial image, the breastplate and the plumed helmet, and they forget that the role is real, that the rifle is real, that the whole thing isn't a costume. But this man's look was different. He wasn't surprised. He was studying it. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then he reached into his coat pocket, took out a small notebook, actual paper, not a phone, and wrote something down. Then he walked away. I noted it, filed it somewhere in the back of my mind the way you do after 23 years. Something's off about that one. And then I let it go because Constance needed to move, and a Japanese tour group was asking the mounted officer on my left if they could sit on his horse, and the sky had made its decision and started raining. I let it go. I shouldn't have. His name, I would later learn, was Gerald Hartwick. He was a barrister, 31 years at the bar, known, apparently in certain legal circles, for taking cases that other people considered unwinnable or undesirable, not for noble reasons, but because he enjoyed the mechanics of them. He liked finding the loose thread in a law and pulling until something came apart. Gerald Hartwick had found a loose thread. And the thread was me. I want to explain something about what we carry, and why, because it becomes important. The household cavalry carries weapons that are functional. The rifles are not props. The ammunition loadout on any given guard duty is something I'm not going to go into detail about, because that's not the point of this story, and it's not information that needs to be in a YouTube video. But the weapons are real, they are inspected, they are maintained, and every guard carrying one is trained. What Hartwick had been studying, what he'd written down in his little notebook, was the specific configuration of my weapon on that day, the way it was positioned, the way it rested across the saddle. He was looking for something he could argue. And he found it. 4 days after that Thursday morning, a private citizen filed a formal complaint with the Metropolitan Police Service, claiming that a member of the Household Cavalry had displayed a firearm in a manner constituting, and I'm quoting here, from the legal document I eventually received, a public order concern inconsistent with civilian safety standards. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because there are aspects of it that are still, even now, sensitive. But the short version is this. The complaint triggered a review. The review triggered an inquiry. The inquiry, because someone, somewhere, made a decision I still don't fully understand, resulted in my being called to give evidence before a district judge in a civil hearing at the Royal Courts of Justice. Not a criminal matter, not a military tribunal, a civil hearing. Gerald Hartwick was the legal representative for the complainant. I found all this out on a Tuesday morning when my commanding officer called me into his office, sat me down, and told me with the particular expression senior officers use when they're furious and not allowed to show it. "Calloway," he said, "you're going to need to wear your full dress uniform to court." The night before the hearing, I didn't sleep much. That's not a dramatic thing to say, it's just true. I lay in bed in my flat in Pimlico, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about 23 years of service, and I thought about Constance, and I thought about that man with the notebook, and I thought, very specifically, about my father. My father was a guardsman, not household cavalry, he was Grenadier Guards, the infantry side. He served for 18 years, and then he came out and he worked in a factory in Wolverhampton, and he never talked much about the service, except for one thing he said to me when I was about 15. Sitting at the kitchen table. "Tommy," he said, he always called me Tommy, which I hated, "the uniform is a promise. You put it on, you're making a promise to something bigger than yourself. Don't let anyone make you feel small in it." I hadn't thought about that in years. I thought about it that night. I got up at 5, made tea, sat in the kitchen in the dark just thinking. By 6 I was dressed. The Royal Courts of Justice looks different when you're there for real. When you're a tourist or a Londoner passing on the bus, it's a backdrop. It's architecture. It's something you glance at and then look away from because you've got somewhere to be. When you're walking through those doors as a participant, it has weight. The ceilings are high in a way that doesn't feel grand, it feels deliberate. Like the building itself is reminding you of your size relative to the institution. I came in through the main entrance in full dress uniform. Blues and royals, the blue tunic, the cuirass, the ceremonial sword, the whole arrangement. I'd also, on instruction from the regimental legal officer, brought my service rifle in a locked transport case, as the judge had requested the weapon be available for examination. The looks I got in that entrance hall. Some people stopped talking mid-sentence. A solicitor in a gray suit nearly walked into a door. A court usher, a woman in her late 50s who'd probably seen everything, looked at me, and then looked at the case, and then looked at me again and made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. I was met by Captain Reeves, the regimental legal officer, and a solicitor from the Ministry of Defense. Both of them looked like they'd been awake as long as I had. We went into a side room and ran through the day's structure, what to expect, what not to say without clarification. "He'll try to confuse the terminology," the solicitor said. He was young, mid-30s, sharp eyes, kept clicking his pen. "Hartwick is good at making technical details sound sinister to people who don't know the field. Don't let him reframe the question. Answer what was actually asked." I nodded. "And Sergeant," Captain Reeves said, looking at me directly, "you're not on trial, you know that, yes. This is an inquiry, you're a witness." "Yes, sir," I said. But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. Courtroom 14 was smaller than I expected. No public gallery to speak of. This was a civil hearing, not a high-profile criminal case. Maybe 20 people in the room, a handful of observers. The complainant, a man I'd never seen before, mid-40s, who turned out to be a civil liberties advocate who'd apparently met Hartwick at a function, sat with his legal team on the left. The judge was a woman named Honorable Justice Patricia Crane. 60 or so, white hair pulled back, the kind of expression that gave away nothing. I would later learn that she'd spent 12 years on the bench after 20 years in family law, and that she had a reputation for running tight hearings. No theatrics, no unnecessary speeches, just questions, evidence, and precision. Gerald Hartwick sat at the other table, and up close he looked exactly like what he was. Intelligent, deliberate, utterly comfortable in that room. He was the sort of man who had learned to use courtrooms the way a carpenter uses a workshop. He knew where everything was, how it fit together, what pressure to apply, and where. He looked at me when I came in. He smiled just slightly. I took the witness stand, was sworn in, and waited. The first hour was straightforward. The Modi solicitor walked me through my service record, my posting, the nature of mounted duty at Horse Guards Parade, the general procedures. Justice Crane asked clarifying questions occasionally, precise, surgical questions that told you she'd already read everything in front of her and wasn't asking anything without purpose. Hartwick sat quietly and took notes. That made me more nervous than if he'd been posturing. Then it was his turn. He stood slowly, adjusted his robes, looked at his notes for just a beat longer than necessary. I recognized that. It's a technique to make the room wait on you. Then he looked up at me. "Sergeant Calloway," he said. His voice was measured, educated, that BBC accent that files everything smooth. "You've been with the Household Cavalry for 23 years. "Yes." "Mounted duties, Horse Guards Parade, Buckingham Palace, Windsor, the ceremonial circuit, so to speak." "Primarily, yes." "And in those 23 years, you've carried a service rifle on duty." "Correct." He let a pause sit there, picked up a photograph from the table. One of his assistants walked it to the clerk, who passed it to me. It was a photograph of me at Horse Guards, taken, I realized, from across the road, long lens, October light. I was on Constance, rifle visible arm at a specific angle. "Is that you in this photograph, Sergeant?" "It is." "Taken on the morning of the 14th of October this year." "I believe so, yes." "And the rifle you're carrying in that image, that is a service weapon, loaded." The word loaded sat in the room differently than the other words. "The rifle is deployed in accordance with standard household cavalry duty protocols," I said, choosing the wording the solicitor had suggested. Hartwick smiled, barely. "I'll take that as a yes." He built it slowly. That's what I remember most about Gerald Hartwick's style. He didn't go for the throat early. He laid bricks, one at a time in a line, patient as a man who'd done this enough to know that patience was the whole game. He asked me about crowd density at Horse Guards on an average Thursday morning. I answered. He asked about the proximity of the tourist viewing area to the guard position. I answered. He asked about school groups, about children specifically, about the average age of visitors, about documented incidents of tourists approaching too close. Every question on its own was reasonable. Put them together in sequence, though, and they were building a picture. And the picture he was building was one where a loaded military weapon was positioned in close proximity to children and civilians without adequate safeguarding, without adequate justification. I watched it happening, and I couldn't stop it because every individual question was answerable and fair. That was the craft of it. Justice Crane watched too. I noticed she was writing more during Hartwick's examination than she had during the earlier testimony. Whether that was good or bad, I couldn't tell. "Let me ask you something more specific," Hartwick said about 90 minutes in. "The rifle you carried on the 14th of October." "Yes." "Can you describe for the court its operational status at the time of the photograph?" The solicitor for the Modi shifted slightly in his seat. Not standing up, not objecting, but a small movement that told me this was the moment we discussed. "The weapon was in the configuration appropriate for mounted ceremonial duties under the current standing orders for the Household Cavalry," I said. "That's a careful answer, Sergeant." He looked up at me over his glasses. "I'm asking something simpler. Was the weapon capable of being fired?" A pause. "Firearms in military service are designed to be operational, yes." "So yes, it was capable of being fired." "Firearms generally are." A small ripple of something in the room, not laughter, too serious for that, but a shift. Hartwick didn't react. "Was it loaded, Sergeant, on that specific morning?" The solicitor started to rise. "My lady, the witness has addressed the operational status of—" "Mr. Hartwick," Justice Crane said, cutting through cleanly, "are you leading somewhere specific with this line? Because I have the duty protocols in the documentation, and if you're going to contest those, I'd rather we get there directly." "My lady, I'm establishing the nature of the weapon for the benefit of this hearing." You've established it, move on. He nodded, unbothered, and moved, but the brick was laid. The weapon itself was brought out near the end of the morning session. That was something I hadn't expected to feel as strange as it did. The locked transport case was opened by Captain Reeves. The rifle was removed, made safe, as it had been throughout, and placed on a table for examination. The court clerk looked at it the way you look at something you intellectually understand, but viscerally don't know how to process. One of the legal assistants at Hartwick's table shifted in her chair. The rifle looked in that room exactly like what it was. Not threatening, it wasn't pointed at anyone, it wasn't in anyone's hands, but present. Substantial, real. Hartwick approached it. He stood looking at it for a moment. This, he said to the room rather than to me, is what was positioned in a public space, on a busy London thoroughfare, within meters of tourists, school children, and members of the civilian public. He paused. I want the court to sit with that for a moment. Mr. Hartwick, Justice Crane said, and there was the first edge of something in her voice now. I don't need to sit with anything. I need to hear evidence and argument, not staging. He inclined his head. Of course, my lady. He turned back to me. Sergeant Calloway, you've been doing this for 23 years. Yes. And in those 23 years, has there ever been a moment, one single moment, where you questioned whether carrying a loaded weapon in a public ceremonial setting was appropriate? It was the question he'd been building, too. I could feel it in the room. Everyone could. The observers who'd been checking their phones had put them down. Justice Crane set her pen on the desk. I looked at Gerald Hartwick, 61 years old, 31 years at the bar, comfortable in every room he'd ever walked into, and I thought about what to say. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know the answer, because I wanted to get it right. Let me stop for a moment and tell you what was actually going through my mind. Because I've told this story a few times since, and people always ask, were you angry? Were you scared? And the answer is neither of those things, not exactly. What I was feeling, what was happening inside me as I sat in that witness box, was something more like a specific kind of clarity. I'd spent 23 years in a role that the British public both revered and misunderstood. They loved the image of the household cavalry. The horses, the uniforms, the ceremony, the pageantry. They photographed us, they filmed us, they brought their children to see us. Some of them pressed too close, tried to make us flinch, waved things in our faces, not out of malice mostly, but out of a failure to understand what they were actually standing in front of. We weren't a performance. We were never a performance. The ceremony has a purpose. The position has a purpose. And the weapon that Gerald Hartwick was now using as a rhetorical prop in a courtroom, had a purpose that had nothing to do with intimidating tourists and everything to do with protecting something real. I knew what my answer was. I'd known it since my father's kitchen table at 15. I just needed 23 years of standing in the rain and the heat and the cameras to understand what it meant. Yes, I said. The room shifted. Hartwick had been expecting a no or a deflection or a qualified professional answer. The yes caught him. He took a small breath. Could you expand on that? You asked if I've ever questioned whether carrying a weapon in a public ceremonial setting was appropriate. The answer is yes. Early in my service, when I was young and the weight of it was still new, I thought about it. I thought about what it meant to stand in front of people who were on holiday, who had children with them, who were there to see something that looked to them like history on display. I paused, and then I understood something. And what was that? He asked it carefully. He could tell something was happening he hadn't planned for. The reason people can stand there safely, I said, and take photographs and bring their children and treat it like a beautiful thing is because the protection is real, because the presence is real. Because the moment something genuinely threatens the safety of this country's institutions or the people near them, the response is not ceremonial. It is not decorative. It is a trained soldier with a real weapon making a real decision. The room was very quiet. The weapon isn't threatening the tourists, Mr. Hartwick. The weapon is why the tourists are safe enough to be there. The silence that followed that lasted maybe 4 seconds. In a courtroom, 4 seconds is a long time. Justice Crane did not write anything. She looked at me, then she looked at Hartwick. Hartwick looked at his notes. He wrote something down, then he looked up again. A very considered answer, Sergeant Calloway, he said. and I could hear that he meant it even if he wasn't giving ground. But let me put something to you. You've described the purpose of the weapon as protective. You've framed the armed presence as a safety measure for the public. Yes. Then help me understand, if the purpose is public safety, why is the configuration of that weapon not governed by civilian firearms protocols? Why is a military rifle held to different accountability standards than, say, an armed police officer on the street? It was a good question, I'll give him that. He sat back slightly. He thought he had me. He didn't. Because, I said, a Royal Guard is not an armed police officer on the street. Semantics, Sergeant. Not semantics, jurisdiction, mandate, and constitutional function. I looked at him steadily. An armed police officer responds to civilian threats under civilian law. A member of the household cavalry is part of a military unit whose constitutional function dates back centuries. A function that exists precisely because some threats require a response that operates outside civilian protocols. The standards are different because the role is different. And the accountability, to the regiment, to the service, to the crown, is not less stringent than civilian firearms law. It is a different structure with different oversight for a different purpose. I'd heard most of that in various forms across 23 years of briefings and procedures, but I hadn't planned to say it. It came out of me the way things do when you've lived something long enough that it becomes part of how you think. Hartwick looked at me for a moment. And who decides, he said quietly, when that different purpose justifies an armed presence among civilians? Parliament, I said. The Secretary of State for Defense, the chain of command, the same people who have decided it for 300 years, with rather more contextual knowledge than either of us has in this room today. Justice Crane made a sound. It wasn't a laugh, it was too controlled for that. But it was something, a small exhale through the nose. One of the observers near the back actually did smile, a brief, involuntary thing that they quickly suppressed. Hartwick didn't show anything. He looked at his notes for a long moment. He picked up a pen. He set it down. He adjusted his robe just slightly, that movement that barristers do when they're recalibrating. Then he looked up at Justice Crane. My lady, I have no further questions for this witness at this time. The lunch recess was 45 minutes. I sat in a side room with Captain Reeves and the Modi solicitor. Neither of them said anything for the first few minutes. There was a tray of sandwiches on a table that no one touched. Someone had put a paper cup of tea in front of me, and I drank it without tasting it. Then the solicitor, the young one, the one who kept clicking his pen, leaned forward and said, "That was not what I prepared you to say." "No," I said. "It was better," he said, and clicked his pen once. Captain Reeves looked at me with an expression I recognized. He was a man who didn't give compliments easily or often. He was the sort of officer who showed approval through the absence of criticism. "You should eat something," he said. I ate a sandwich. The afternoon session was shorter. Hartwick called one additional witness, an academic, a professor of civil law from University College London, who spoke for 40 minutes about the legal framework governing armed forces in public spaces, the historical development of firearms regulations, and the question of whether military ceremonial duty should be subject to enhanced civilian oversight. He was articulate and detailed, and about halfway through, I realized he was actually quite sympathetic to the household cavalry's position, or at least to a balanced reading of it. Hartwick had perhaps expected a more oppositional performance. Justice Crane asked the professor 2 questions. Both were sharp and specific. Both were answered carefully. Then it was the Modi solicitor's turn to cross-examine, and he, to his credit, did something very simple. He asked the professor 3 questions about the historical record of the household cavalry's ceremonial and operational roles, all of which had clear and unambiguous answers that supported the argument that the regiment's mandate was well-established, well-regulated, and functioning exactly as it was designed to. It was over by 3:30. Justice Crane took a recess of 20 minutes to consider her ruling. I've heard that in civil hearings, rulings sometimes take days or weeks. The fact that this one was happening in the room, on the same day, in 20 minutes, told me something. Either it was very simple, or she'd already known what she was going to say, and just wanted the procedural decorum of appearing to deliberate. I stood in the corridor outside Courtroom 14. Just stood there in my full dress uniform, in that high-ceilinged corridor with its Gothic arches, and its smell of old wood and something else. A woman walked past court staff by the look of her badge and stopped when she saw me. Just for a second, looked at the uniform, the cuirass, the whole thing. Then said very quietly, almost to herself, "You look like something out of history." I didn't know what to say to that. "Thank you," I said. She nodded and walked on. I thought about it for the whole 20 minutes. Justice Crane's ruling was 11 minutes long. I'm not going to reproduce it in detail. It's a legal document, and there are parts of it that are specific to the civil proceedings and wouldn't make much sense without the full context of the hearing. But I can tell you the core of it. She found, in summary, that the complaint as filed did not disclose a sufficient legal basis for further inquiry or regulatory action. She found that the deployment of the household cavalry in its ceremonial and operational capacity at Horse Guards Parade was lawfully authorized, subject to appropriate military oversight, and that the configuration of weapons on duty was a matter for the regiment and its chain of command, not for civil review absent specific evidence of a genuine public safety incident. In plain language, the complaint was dismissed. But there was a part of her ruling that I've thought about many times since. Near the end, after the legal conclusions. She set her papers down and looked at the room over her glasses, and she said, "And this is as close to exact as I can get. This court has heard evidence from a witness with 23 years of service who gave testimony that was clear, considered, and grounded in genuine institutional knowledge. Whatever questions surround the broader policy debate about armed presence in public spaces, and there are legitimate questions to be asked, the conduct and professionalism of the individual before us today is not among them." She said it to the room. Hartwick made a note, and I sat in my chair and looked at my hands for a moment, and I thought about my father. Gerald Hartwick spoke to me briefly outside the courtroom. I wasn't expecting that. He'd gathered his papers, said something quiet to the complainant, and then, as I was passing through the corridor, he stopped. "Sergeant Calloway." I stopped. He looked at me the way he'd looked at the rifle that morning, studying, assessing, no hostility in it. "You understood what I was actually asking," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I think so," I said. "The question wasn't really about your rifle." "I know." He nodded. "It never is." He looked up at the arches above us, that long stone corridor. "The question is always about accountability, whether the institution is still worthy of the trust placed in it." I thought about that, and what's your answer? He looked back at me. "That depends on the institution and the individuals inside it." He paused. Today, on both counts, the answer was yes. Then he picked up his case and walked away down the corridor. His footsteps echoed until he turned the corner and the sound stopped. I came out of the Royal Courts of Justice at 4:47 in the afternoon. The light had changed while I was inside. That October light that London does in the mid-afternoon, amber and thin, coming in low over the Strand, catching the sandstone of the buildings and making them look warm in a way that London doesn't usually manage. The evening rush was starting. Black cabs and red buses. A tour group coming around the corner from the direction of Temple. A cyclist weaving through with aggressive confidence, and then nearly clipping a bollard and wobbling in a way that was slightly undignified. Normal London. Just normal London. I stood on the steps for a moment. I still had the transport case with me. Captain Reeves was coming up behind me, phone already out, dealing with whoever needed to be informed first. The Modi solicitor was flagging a cab. A man walking past slowed when he saw me. Tourist, German, I thought, by the camera around his neck and the style of his waterproof jacket. He looked at the uniform, at the case, at the overall effect of a fully dressed household cavalry sergeant standing on the steps of the Royal Courts of Justice in October. He raised his camera, then he stopped himself as if he was checking whether it was polite to ask. I nodded, "Go ahead." He took the photograph, looked at it on his camera screen, said something in German that I didn't understand, but that sounded, by the tone of it, positive. Then he gave me a small, serious nod, one of those nods that means something across language barriers, and walked on. I've thought about that photograph a lot. Not the one Hartwick used, The surveillance image taken across the road with a long lens, the one that started all of this. That one was taken without my knowledge, used as evidence, placed on a table in a courtroom. I've thought about the tourist's photograph. The same uniform, the same rifle in its case, the same person, but taken differently, asked for, acknowledged, offered freely. A moment of recognition between a man who spent his afternoon in a courtroom being questioned about his role, and a stranger who saw something in that role worth recording. Same image, completely different meaning. That's the thing about what we carry. The weapon, the uniform, the responsibility, none of it means the same thing depending on who's looking at it and why. To Hartwick, it was a question. To the complainant, it was a threat. To Justice Crane, it was evidence. To the German tourist on the steps, it was something he wanted to remember. To me, it's 23 years of standing still when every instinct says to move. It's rain in November and heat in July, and the particular sound of Constance shifting her weight when she's tired and doesn't want to show it. It's my father at a kitchen table in Wolverhampton telling me that a uniform is a promise. I went back on duty 4 days later. Horse Guards Parade, the same arch, the same spot where Hartwick had stood with his notebook on a Thursday in October. It was raining, a proper London rain, the kind that comes sideways, and there was a school group on a visit, maybe 10 years old, wrapped in matching yellow high-visibility vests over their coats. They gathered in a loose cluster in front of me and Constance. One of them, a girl with red Wellington boots, looked up and pointed. "Miss," she said to the teacher, loudly enough that I could hear it clearly over the rain, "why does he have a gun?" The teacher started to answer, the usual tourist-friendly explanation, ceremonial, historical. Tradition. The girl looked at me. She had that expression children have when they're trying to decide whether the adult answer they've been given is actually sufficient or whether they should push further. I kept my eyes forward, as required, as trained. But I thought, because someone has to. Because ceremony without the capacity to defend it isn't ceremony, it's theater. Because this street, this city, this institution, these people in their yellow vests looking up at the horses, all of it is worth protecting. All of it requires something real behind the pageant. The girl in the red Wellingtons stared at me for another few seconds. Then she turned to her friend and said, "I think he's very brave." Her friend agreed. And the rain kept coming, and Constance shifted slightly under me. And somewhere across the courtyard, a tourist was taking a video that would probably end up on the internet, and I stood my post. As I have done. As I will do. Because the question Gerald Hartwick asked me, the real one, the one underneath all the legal framing and the long lens photographs, and the civil hearing at the Royal Courts of Justice, was this. Is the institution still worth defending? And my answer, then and now, is the same one I gave from that witness box. It is not about the rifle. It was never about the rifle. It is about what the rifle stands for, what we stand for. And as long as we stand for something real, something worth protecting, I'll be at my post. In the rain, in the heat, in the courtroom if they need me there. Standing still while everything moves around me. That's the promise, and I intend to keep it.